Are we ever gonna get there?
Sarah whined from the back seat.
We still have a ways to go, Pumpkin,
my wife replied. I could tell that she was as tired of being in the car as the kids were. Jeremy was still passed out in the back seat next to his sister. He must have been sleeping hard because all of her whines and wails were not so much as causing him to stir.
How much longer?
Sarah cried out in her most pitiful voice yet after a few more minutes passed by. We're still a long way off, kiddo, I replied, trying not to sound as irritated as I was starting to feel. We started calling her Pumpkin after the first Halloween she was old enough to enjoy. I can't say that I was a particular fan of the holiday, having spent my childhood just outside London where I was born. My family moved to the States when I was 15, after my father got a job offer he couldn't refuse. I'm 34 now, and a similar opportunity is now taking my family and me across the country. Sarah's first Halloween costume was a little pumpkin onesie with a cap that had a small green stem protruding out the top. She loved it so much and refused to wear anything else for the weeks following her night of trick-or-treating. She couldn't say the word quite right, so Pumpkin became a moniker, inspired by her own words. As much as I did not care for that time of year, she adored it. I attempted to convince my family to try out my old tradition of sporting the ancient garb of Guy Fawkes on November 5th, which I used to celebrate when I was a child. Safe to say it wasn't their cup of tea. When Jeremy joined our little flock, it didn't take him long to find his love for Halloween too. I was in the minority with my distaste for the occasion, but it was hard to argue too much with something that brought the kids such glee. The children and my wife were all of the same fear, that our cross-country move in the middle of October would make the season traditions difficult to celebrate. I assured them that the subdivision we were adopting as our new home looked to provide far more opportunities for trees than the one we had left behind. I can't speak to whether it was enough to set the minds at ease, but it was something at least.
Maybe we should get off the road for a bit,
Jessica suggested. We had planned to stop at a hotel at some point in our trip across the country. The idea of forcing the kids to endure 14 hours straight in the car was enough to make us all exhausted, just the thought. I wanted to make a little more progress before stopping off for the night, but I couldn't deny that the 6 hours I had already spent behind the wheel were making me feel a little bit on edge. As much as I adored our little Pumpkin, her whines were starting to inspire far more frustration. Just a little longer, babe, I replied to my wife's request. Truthfully, I was hoping to find some sort of landmark or otherwise pleasant location to spend our break from driving. I had meant to do a little research before we left, to plan out a good place to stop off, but it completely slipped my mind. We had loaded up the trailer with all of our belongings over the days before we headed out, but that only served to exhaust my body and mind.
Daddy!
Sarah exclaimed from the back seat with jubilation in her voice.
Look, 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 look!
She cried out, thrusting her little pointer finger in between where my wife and I sat. Sammy's Halloween Spooktacular, the billboard read. Jess gave me a look I knew all too well, a broad, mischievous smile with a twinkle in her eye that read, "Come on, babe." I let out a sigh, smiling back at her. Sarah's excited screaming had woken up her brother, causing him to join in on the shared glee that my wife and daughter were already overflowing with. He showed absolutely no sign of drowsiness, regardless of being dramatically yanked from his sleep. I miss those days, I thought, smiling at my giddy family. I can't even remember the last time I woke up with anything resembling energy, let alone the ability to jump around while confined by a seatbelt. Alright, I chuckled, causing the rest of the vehicle's inhabitants to bellow their appreciation. I can't say I was anywhere near as thrilled as they were, but I couldn't say no to the smiling faces. The information I could make out on the billboard indicated that it was still a good 20 miles ahead, so I pushed the pedal down a bit to hasten our arrival. There was absolutely no way I had any hope of getting the kids to settle down, as the same sign reappeared every couple of miles. Every single one we passed caused more yells of anticipation, and as happy as I was to see them excited, I could feel a throbbing headache begin to set in. Some 15 or 20 minutes later, I pulled off the exit that promised our adventures were close at hand. There were a few fast food joints and truck stops directly off the short road that branched from the interstate, but the new, smaller signs on the side of the road indicated that Sammy's was still up the road a little bit. After another handful of miles, we arrived at what seemed to be the main strip of whatever town we had landed in. There were plenty of little tourist attractions and a boatload of roadside motels before we reached the large and colorfully creepy-looking building that bore the same title as the billboards we had seen for the last half hour. "How about you guys go check it out, and I'll go set up a hotel room," I suggested, mildly hopeful to avoid having to enter the spooktacular environment.
You don't want to come, Daddy?
Sarah exclaimed, pouting slightly. "It's not that, Pumpkin," I replied, knowing full well it was indeed that. "I just want to make sure we can get a room before they all sell out." Jess gave me a sideways glance, and I had no doubt she could tell that the traffic wasn't remotely heavy enough to imply that the numerous hotels were hurting for rooms. She still gave me a cute half-smile, accompanied by a quick wink. She knew Halloween wasn't my thing, so I was certain she wouldn't hold my bailing out on the event against me.
"It definitely would be a pain to have to get back onto the interstate to find a room for the night,"
she said, loosely backing up my play.
"Oh,"
both kids whined in unison. It did make me feel bad to let them down, but as we pulled into the spacious parking lot of the best haunted experience in the country, according to the flare on the signpost, their pouting veered back to excitement. I pulled up as close as I could to the entrance while holding the enormous trailer filled with a house load of furniture and labeled boxes, and I handed Jess one of my credit cards to cover the entry fees. She gave me a kiss before getting out of our extended cab truck, to much ew-ing from both of the kids.
"Bye-bye, Daddy,"
Sarah yelled out when my family made their way to the entrance, hand in hand. Jeremy was already fully focused on the festivities within his reach to waste any time on goodbyes. "I love you guys. Have fun," I shouted to the trio as they strolled happily away from me before I circled out of the exit to the parking lot. I chose to head over to the nearest and nicest looking hotel that would prove to be easily within walking distance of Sammy's. I respectfully carried my truck and trailer to the rear of the parking area to stay out of the way of any vehicles that would much more conveniently inhabit the closer spaces. After setting up 2 adjoining rooms for the night, I went ahead and unloaded our overnight bags and carried them up to our second-floor lodgings. I sent Jess a text with the room numbers and let her know that I arranged for the front desk to hold on to any of the key cards in case we ended up bypassing each other as I walked back to the roadside attraction. It seemed unlikely that we would miss each other with such a short distance between us, but I knew some of these tourist spots would have a rear exit so folks leaving wouldn't get in the way of those entering. I didn't receive a reply to my message, so I assumed they were in the middle of having a fright load of fun, as the flyers at the hotel suggested were likely to occur. It didn't take long to arrive back at the parking lot to Sammy's on foot, so I was sure they would have made it through the attractions by now. I hadn't heard back from my wife, but she was often prone to leaving me hanging on text messages, so I thought nothing of it. As I walked closer, I really took in the size of the place for the first time. It was set up to look like a giant, classically styled haunted house, various colors of tarnished sidings, and a wide variety of warnings spray-painted on the walls. They looked like something cruel teenagers would apply to the house belonging to the neighborhood weirdo. "Turn back now. You'll never last until morning. Save yourself," were just a handful of the phrases painted across the large building. It had to be a solid 5 stories tall at least, and looked like it had set them back a healthy chunk of cash. There was the classic seasonal assembly of horrific characters just outside the entrance. Werewolves, evil-looking scarecrows, vampires, and the like, all set up in their best mid-action poses to alarm those who may pass by. Though I didn't care for the theme, I can argue that it all looked quite convincing. When I pushed open the door to the lobby, I heard a ghostly howl that seemed to be triggered by a motion sensor behind the entryway. I rolled my eyes at this one as it seemed a little cliché. Of course, well done or not, this whole place was quite the stereotype, but I imagine it was effective for the target audience. Though festive decor lined the interior as much as the exterior, I was surprised to see that it looked not dissimilar to a common movie theater lobby on the inside. They even had a concession stand, though it sold just as many self-advertising trinkets as it did snacks and beverages. T-shirts bearing such phrases as "I survived the 6 floors of terror," or other simpler ones bearing the title of the establishment hung on pegs to the side of the counter, along with hats, hoodies, and even expensive-looking jackets.
Welcome to Sammy's. How many in your party?
A monotone voice beckoned from somewhere to the side of me, breaking my staring contest with the clothing accessories. No party actually, I replied to the cute blonde girl dressed like a rag doll who approached me. I'm looking for my family.
Name?
She requested, looking quite bored by her job. Hawthorne. Jessica, Sarah, and Jeremy Hawthorne, I replied. She began tapping her fingers across the screen of the tablet she held. It had a wide case around it shaped like a skull. Honestly, it looked like it would be quite cumbersome to use, with such ridiculous padding, but she seemed to have no issues with it.
It looks like they're still enjoying the attractions,
she said after completing a search. Wow, I replied. It's been a while now. How long does this thing go on for?
It depends on how many floors you get through. Sometimes up to an hour if they're brave enough.
You're welcome to take a seat and wait for them, she said, gesturing to a row of benches off to the side of the lobby. Right. Thanks, I said dismissively before walking over to take a seat. By this point, it was already close to an hour since I dropped off my wife and kids, but there may have been some sort of line to get in. There was a small group gathered up in front of the big doors to the rear of the lobby, seemingly awaiting whatever their allotted time was. Surely this was the case for Jess and the kids, too. Assuming they had perhaps had to wait a little bit before entering, adding however long they stood in line to the amount of floors they had to get through, it could still be a while. After another 30 minutes passed, I was growing quite restless, regardless of my inner reasoning. The other group had entered a little while back, and I still saw no sign of my family. I badgered the ragdoll again, only to receive a similarly dismissive conversation as the one we had before. I kindly asked her to speak to a manager, as this was clearly going nowhere. She seemed reluctant to grant my request, but placed a phone call nonetheless.
He should be with you shortly. Please take a seat until he gets here, she said, gesturing back to the same bench I sat on previously, as though I had somehow forgotten his existence. Perhaps I was allowing my annoyance to take root, but this was becoming a little ridiculous. Surprisingly, while I sat there tapping my heel against the carpet, only a few minutes passed by before, "Well, hello there, my frightful friend," almost bellowed from the portly man to my left. "And what can your old buddy Sammy do for you?" He was very theatrical in his words and actions as he spoke in an almost exaggerated Scottish accent. "I'm looking for my family," I replied without hesitation. "I dropped them off about an hour and a half ago and they're still not out." "Well, good Lord!" he exclaimed in a horrendous imitation of an English accent. "We got us a proper limey among us. Pip pip and tally-ho!" he continued as he practically bounced his plump little body from the floor to click his heels together. "Look, mate, I just want to see my family, yeah?" I said, feeling more aggravated with the rotund man, dressed in the style of a circus ringleader. "Oi, easy on, governor. I was just having a little fun." "Give it a bloody rest," I exclaimed, grabbing the man by his collar before slurring my words in hopes of this fool taking me seriously. "Where is my fucking family?" "My apologies, good sir," he replied, tipping his hat while still wearing that sheepish grin. "Look," I said, letting go of the man and taking a few steps back from him. "I'm sorry, yeah? I'm just worried about my kids. It's been a while and I haven't seen any sign of them." The man nodded to the rag doll, who quickly brought him her rubber skull-wrapped device. He tapped away on the screen, still keeping every action almost comically exaggerated. "Oh, looks like they got through all 6 floors," he exclaimed with his eyes wide. "Likely they'll be enjoying the restaurant and arcade at the bottom." "The bottom?" I asked, glancing upwards at the ceiling I assumed to be the base of the 2nd floor. "The 6 floors of fear go down, me boy," he grinned, fully returning to his Scottish brogue. "How can I meet them down there?" "Only if you brave the floors yourself," he said, proudly straightening his posture. "Oh, come on, isn't there like an employee's entrance or something?" "Well, of course, boyo, but such things are no fit for mere mortals to cross. Come on, don't you want to have some Halloween fun yourself?" "I don't give a flying fuck about Halloween, mate. Just take me to my family, you smug little shit." A certain amount of malice crossed his face for a moment. We locked eyes in what felt like a completely childish staring contest. Something was very unsettling about the way he looked at me as his mouth twitched ever so slightly. "If you want to get to your loved ones," he sneered, "you need to descend the 6 floors. Are you brave enough to face your fears, me boy?" Fine. How much? I couldn't help but assume this whole thing was just a setup to squeeze more cash out of me, but I was actually quite surprised and perhaps even a little impressed when the man with the red beard said, "It's on the house," grinning wildly before making a theatrical bow. "For the misunderstanding, of course." He gestured to the small group that had gathered in front of the wide entrance, which was made up to look like heavy iron doors. Feeling defeated and annoyed, I slowly dragged my feet, carrying on like a kid attempting to delay bath time, over to the 6 other people that stood before the entryway. "Do try to enjoy yourself," the pudgy-faced man said as the doors creaked open. I instantly found my eyes rolling again as I looked upon the predictable strobing lights that flickered beyond the entryway. The 2 teen couples in front of the group huddled together while the boys gave each other a grin. The girls, who wrapped themselves around the dates, were certainly overselling their fears at the silly sights ahead. I remember such games when I was younger. "Yeah, someone's getting laid tonight," I thought, allowing a chuckle to escape my mouth. The closest teen to the front had shaggy dark hair and wore a Letterman jacket, while the girl who held on to him had her blonde hair tied into pigtails and wore a red and white cheerleader outfit. The other girl had long black hair that hung to the middle of her back and a blue mini dress, while the guy who stood beside her had short brown hair parted in the center and wore a blue and white striped button-up shirt and dark, purposely ripped jeans. The remaining 2 members of the group whose company I would be forced to share for the next hour or so looked to be in the mid-20s. The taller of the 2 wore a white shirt and tie, with a grey pinstripe vest that was buttoned up in the center. His jeans were also stylishly ripped, and he had a dark chin-strap beard, a thin mustache, and spiked black hair. The other had a shaved head and a thicker yet tidy blonde beard. He wore a tight beige sweater that accented his athletic build and baggy light blue jeans. I couldn't get a read on my new companions, but I hoped it would help make this experience as tolerable as possible. Floor 1. As we made our way through the makeshift hallways, likely made of cheap wood, draped in dark cloth, I kept checking my phone to see if Jess had replied yet. I almost winced every time one of the teenage girls made an over-the-top scream, while wrapping their bodies further around their dates. Plenty of costumed men and women jumped out from behind walls to bring frights to those who could not see that shit coming from a mile away. Some seemed more into it than others. The guy in the Scream getup acted like he'd rather be drilling down some online friends on whatever shooter game took his fancy than uttering monotoned and scratchy-voiced threats to some overly excited teens and a few underwhelmed adults. After a few minutes, we cleared the black-draped walls and found ourselves looking at a stairway that led down to sights unseen. The fluorescent lights that were mounted to the ceiling above the steps flickered almost as much as the strobes we had only cleared moments ago. I let out another heavy sigh and checked my phone again, while the airheads in front attempted to sound convincing in their terror at the thought of descending to the 2nd floor. It wasn't until then that I really took in the implications of 6 floors going downwards. How deep did they have to dig to build this bloody place? My thoughts were cut short when a man in a bloody apron, wearing a burlap sack over his head and wielding a roaring chainsaw, came charging at us. A ridiculous abundance of shrieking came from the front of the group before the 2 couples scampered down the steps. The 2 guys in the back strolled quite quickly behind them, while I just began my descent at an average pace. I wanted to get back to my family as quickly as I could, but I wasn't about to let myself get dragged into this silliness. Floor 2. As I approached the bottom of the staircase, I saw that all 6 of my associates for the day were standing in a row. None of them were moving, and even the dramatic teenage girls were silent while they gripped tightly onto the boyfriends. When I got level with them, I found my jaw hanging open when I looked upon the darkly lit woods that lay beyond the landing. There was no evidence of walls to our sides or a ceiling above our heads. All I could make out above the fairly dense forest was the night sky with a bright moon shining down. "What the fuck is this?" I asked, mostly to myself. "Maybe the stairs led us outside," the taller of the mid-20s guy said, completely unconvincingly. It's just special effects, the dark-haired teenager next to the pigtailed girl remarked, attempting to sound confident.
Can we just go back?
The girl replied, her voice trembling slightly.
This is just too weird.
Quit being a pussy. None of this shit is real, the other boy said before being smacked across the chest by his date.
Don't be an asshole, Greg.
After some back and forth, the group agreed to turn around and head back up the steps. I was sure this was just all some sort of gimmick, but I couldn't deny that this floor looked as though it would take some time to get through. I desperately wanted to get back to my family, but I hoped I could maybe walk around the building and reach the arcade another way. If this building really did lead down another 6 floors, surely there was some way to get there from the outside. What the hell? The spiky-haired 20-something guy exclaimed, mirroring my thoughts when we turned around to see only more woods behind us. It's gotta be an illusion or something, his friend said before walking towards where the stairs stood only moments ago, with his arms outstretched in front of him. He traced his hands around like he was trying to find a light switch in a dark room, but he only walked further than where we had entered from. They must have retracted them, the confident teenage boy who had recently received a slap from his girl said. More conversation erupted among our small group while they attempted to understand what was going on, but I just wanted to get moving. Having no interest in wasting time standing around and listening to any more pointless arguing, I started walking forward in the direction the stairs had stood before. I reasoned that if this was indeed another floor, I would have to make my way under the one above to reach another possible flight of stairs. That seemed logical enough at the time, anyway. Where the fuck are you going? The cheerleader's boyfriend called out. I'm looking for the next stairway, I replied, not so much as turning around as I continued to walk away from the group. You're going the wrong way, dingus, he exclaimed, laughing at my apparent ignorance. We're in a forest, mate, I replied, shrugging off his insult as uncertainty mixed with adolescent cockiness. Who knows what's right and wrong? Fuck that limey fruit, I heard the cocky kid's friend say from behind me. He can get himself lost. Let's get moving in the right direction. He spoke loudly to make sure I heard him, but I wasn't about to waste my time picking fights with children. Moments like these only made me dread my kid's teenage years more than I already did. I still heard the voices in the distance as I made my way through the trees, but I felt no need to register the words. After walking for a little while, I came to a clearing in the trees that housed a large stone altar with an inscription that read, "When the moon is full, they come to play." I rubbed my fingers across the tablet and found myself quite surprised and slightly impressed that it felt like cold and bumpy stone, not some cheaply made styrofoam prop. They really had spared no expense with this place. While I glanced around my surroundings, almost mentally checked out while seeking any sign of a trail or path to follow, I heard something that almost made my heart leap out of my throat.
Daddy?
My daughter's voice called from somewhere else. Sarah? I yelled out. Had she gotten lost in this place? I wondered, cutting my eyes in all directions, desperate to find where my little girl was. Could Jess and Jeremy be out there too?
Daddy, help me,
she shouted with panic in her voice. I'm coming, Pumpkin. Just keep calling out and I'll follow your voice, I yelled as I ran in the direction of the sound. No matter how quickly I moved, her words grew no closer. Branches whipped me in the face as I weaved in and out of the trees, but I could not find any trace of my daughter anywhere.
Daddy, he's hurting me,
she cried out, causing my movements to become even more erratic as panic swelled in my chest.
Daddy, Daddy, Daddy!
Her voice kept calling, with every repetition of my moniker coming from a different direction. I spun in place, feeling dizzy from the jerking my head in a new angle for every repetition of my daughter's words.
Daddy,
Daddy, Daddy, Daddy,
continued to echo through the woods as the voice grew deeper and more haunting than my child was capable of sounding.
Daddy, 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 Daddy.
Finally stopping in place, attempting to allow the burning in my chest to settle down, I could still make out nothing more than the trees and overgrown greenery. That was until one final
Daddy
was calmly spoken from directly behind me. It was not even close to Sarah's voice anymore. It sounded almost gargled and disturbingly deep. I noticed the scent of something foul surrounding me, with heavy breaths brushing across the back of my neck.
Help me, Daddy?
The voice said, before I slowly turned around. I found my jaw hanging wide once more when I turned to see the fleshy and wrinkled chest of what appeared to be some sort of monstrous parody of my sweet little girl. It stood probably 9 or 10 feet tall, 2 to 3 times as wide as I. 2 muscled and deformed arms hung almost to the ground, aside far skinnier and bony legs. The chest looked emaciated behind the stretched and torn unicorn t-shirt Sarah had been wearing today. The large head had a low-hanging jaw that lay open and drooling while jutted out in an unsettling and crooked underbite. 2 different-sized, though still unnaturally enlarged eyes looked down at me. They were the exact same shade of grey-blue as my daughter's. The red hair that was tied back into a ponytail sprouted from somewhere in the back of that thing's head, also mimicking that of my beloved baby girl. "You're not her," I exclaimed, slowly backing away from the creature wearing the shredded clothes my girl had worn this very day.
Daddy.
It whined, sounding like the guttural moans of a large and wounded animal.
Don't you love me anymore?
It wailed out in a goggled whimper as it walked closer, with its elongated arms stretched out towards me. I continued backing away, shaking my head from side to side. I was trying to convince myself that this was not some sort of abomination formed from some sort of cruel experiment on my little girl, but that very thought was stabbing into me more and more. "You're not her. You're not her," I said over and over like some sort of bargaining prayer as tears flowed down my face.
But Daddy, it's me.
The creature still reached out for me, opening and closing its gigantic hands as heavy tears leaked from behind its uneven eyes. I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. But that knowledge was not enough to fully convince my frenzied mind. I continued to back away, losing my footing to a large discarded branch on the forest floor. Whether it was the stick or one of my bones that broke that caused the snapping sound when I landed on the ground, I couldn't register at the time. All I could see, the one and only aspect of my surroundings that made it past my eyes and into my panicked brain, was the approaching abomination that hoped to convince me it was my child.
Daddy.
It called again as it moved in closer. I skidded my heels against the grass and dirt, desperate to escape this horrendous thing, while my tears splashed against my shirt with every erratic movement I made to break free. As it reached a lengthy and muscled arm for me, I braced myself for whatever it had planned. Just as the wide fingers made it to wrap around my face, something sharp and barbed burst from its emaciated chest, spraying dark fluids across my jeans and the forest floor. The creature coughed, goggling on the blood that leaked from its mouth as it fell to its knees and slumped over to the ground to reveal the back end of the jagged tree branch that had been gouged through its flesh. "You okay, man?" The heavily breathing voice of the taller of the 20-something guys said as he ran around from behind the beast that now lay half sideways on the ground. I cried out one final,
Daddy.
before the long arm it reached up at me flopped lifelessly to the grassy floor. A single choking breath passed its mutated lips before it lay still and silent. I was still shaking my head from side to side, entranced by the mutated thing that wore my daughter's clothes as it spilled dark blood across the leaves and discarded twigs. What the fuck is going on?" I asked the boy, who was now helping me back to my feet. Bargaining to regain my senses and composure, I looked at the kid who had impaled the thing that now lay still. He had a deep gash across his left eyebrow, and the right sleeve of his shirt was missing. Another 4 people came staggering through the trees, looking as though they'd been through some shit. The other kid in his 20s was limping while bracing himself with a sturdy-looking branch. His right knee was caked in blood and wrapped with a sleeve from his friend's shirt. The teenage boy with the dark-haired girlfriend appeared unharmed, but she clung to him in a much more convincing fashion than her flirtatious manner before. The other girl was on the ground, sobbing into her hands. Her outfit was covered in crimson blotches, and her stockings were torn on both shins, where twin gashes leaked through the splits.
"This ain't no fucking game," the guy perched on the heavy branch said. The one who saved me from the approaching monstrosity went on to explain that they were attacked by some sort of hunched-over creatures with long fur covering the bodies and sharp claws on the hands. The arrogant kid who wore the Letterman jacket thought they were part of the show, laughing the whole thing off. He strolled up to them to take a selfie. One of the beasts bit into his throat, while the other tore the arm off that held the cell phone outstretched. A battle had ensued, which caused the shredding of the one guy's knee and the gashes across the shins of the dead teen's girlfriend. They managed to kill the animals, or whatever they were, but it wasn't easy. Once the dust settled, the cheerleader wrestled to wake up her boyfriend, with a shot convincing her that he wasn't hurt that badly. "Jesus Christ," I exclaimed, still taking glances at the thing that had pretended to be my daughter. "God, I hope it was pretending," the voice in the back of my head argued. I shook my head, hoping to brush those thoughts away. Regardless of whatever these things were, hidden away within the trees, I was still terrified at the thought of my family being out there somewhere. Even though I would not allow myself to believe that beast was somehow my adorable little girl, just the idea of what they may be enduring prevented my rapid pulse from easing. "We gotta get moving," the tall kid said. "No telling what else is out there." The teenage couple helped a sobbing girl up, wrapping their arms around her. The other guy assisted his friend with the bandaged leg before we began walking, though we were thoroughly lost by now. On our journey through the trees, we heard rustling leaves and stampeding feet, but nothing else sprung out at us. With every sound, we all tensed up, preparing for a fight, but nothing else came for us. It took us some time, but after walking for God knows how long, we all shared sighs of relief when we approached a parting of the trees that led to concrete pavement. The solid pathway led directly to another flight of stairs, which resembled those that may descend into a subway tunnel. I checked my phone again to see that I had still not received word from my wife, but I attempted to convince myself that my family was all right, even if I didn't believe it. I was worried that they may still be on the floor that we were now leaving behind. Something told me that they were ahead of us. I couldn't put my finger on what was convincing me of that, but somehow I knew I had to keep going. Once again, the shoddy lights flickered above our heads as we made our way down to the next floor. I had no way of knowing what we may face next, but the first floor paled in comparison to the second. I've never been a religious man, but I can't say I didn't internally say a small prayer as we walked down into the darkness below. Floor 3. Just as I had predicted, the stairway led to what appeared to be an abandoned subway. The lights above our heads still blinked in and out, but other than the buzzing noise they made, the tunnel was completely silent. Old cups, wrappers, and paper bags lined the concrete floor, along with newspaper pages that appeared decades old. The paper was yellowed and even burnt in places, but the words were still legible. I was still shivering from head to toe, unable to break my thoughts away from the freakish creature in my daughter's clothes. I had to find my family, no matter what. Though part of my mind was still scared they could have been lost on the floor above, I knew I had to plunder forwards. It hurt me more so for Jess and the kids than myself to see what should have been a pleasantly creepy Halloween experience having turned out to be something like this. I think my wife loved this time of year even more than the kids. Even before our little pumpkin came along, Jessica always made sure our house was the most decorated for the season. Every year, we would add more and more eerie and macabre decor to our home, so it was only natural the kids would grow to love it too. She told me once that it was almost like a sacred holiday in her family, and she would never allow us to be seen not following the traditions. Even though I never cared for it, I would go out of my way to make her happy when October approached. She would get like a giddy child when it was getting close. "Subway fire claims the life of hundreds," the teenage boy called from behind me. I turned around to see him crouched on the ground holding one of the discarded newspaper pages. His girlfriend and her friend were still huddled together while he squatted in front of them. The other two guys were just looking around the empty concrete tunnel. "It's got today's date on it," the boy on the floor exclaimed. "Yeah, of course it does," I whispered to myself with a sigh. "Huh?" the kid reading the paper asked, apparently having heard me speak.
Nothing, I said dismissively. Hey, we saved your ass, man, he called out, getting back to his feet and stomping towards me. I'm just thinking out loud, mate. No disrespect intended. You better not disrespect me, you fucking old fart, he said under his breath as he walked back to the girls. I shook my head as my mind took me back to my adolescent years. I was always ready to pick a fight, constantly seeking opportunities to make myself look tough in front of others. It wasn't the easiest thing, being a foreign kid in an American school. My accent made me a target, so I made sure to overcompensate should the opportunity arise. I got in plenty of scuffles for no good reason, but other kids left me alone after a while. Whether I actually intimidated them, or they just didn't want to put up with my shit, I suppose I'll never know. We all do what we have to, I guess. At least we only have one direction to go this time, the guy who braced himself with the tree branch said. Not so much, I replied, pointing towards where we had approached from. Ah, shit, he sighed when he turned to look at the now absent stairway, which left an open tunnel in its wake. Yep. We all stood around in silence for a bit. I checked my phone several more times, each glance revealing the same lack of contact with my family. Somehow I still had 4 bars of reception, but I still hadn't received word from Jess. Well, we figure out what to do next, the guy with the makeshift crutch suggested. Maybe we should introduce ourselves. Perhaps it would be best to have some names to go with the phases, since we were forced to be in each other's company for the time being. With the agreement of the group, we all offered to names while we rested up for a moment. Tony, the tall, well-dressed guy who impaled my would-be daughter, told us that he and his boyfriend Calvin, who was now propped beside him, using his strength to hold him upright instead of the branch, said that they met each other online. When they finally managed to arrange an in-person meeting, they knew they had something special. Some months later, after only getting to see each other on the weekends, Tony relocated to be closer to Calvin. Together, they now ran a podcast that inspired them to go undercover to a variety of roadside attractions such as these. They'd exposed quite a few over the years, for safety hazards along with an array of other violations. Bridget and Monica were cheerleaders at the same high school, in which they had been friends since the 6th grade. They're in their senior year now, along with Gregory and Todd, the 2 boys whose company they shared today. Gregory, who currently lay dead on the floor above, was on the football team of the school they all attended. He and Bridget had been together for 6 months, while his friend Todd, who went to a different school, was a blind date for Monica. They had hit it off right off the bat, and planned to see more of each other if we ever saw the outside world again. After getting to know the other members of the group a little bit, we all agreed to work on this as a team to get through this. No more wandering off on our own, Tony said, giving me a wink. I shrugged and nodded my agreement. We all chuckled a little, except for Bridget, who still appeared almost catatonic. After we felt like we had taken sufficient enough time to rest and gather our collective composure, we all agreed to follow the path that led behind where the staircase dropped us off. We couldn't exactly pinpoint which was the correct direction on the floor above, as we were all so turned around by the time we found our way to the stairs, we had no basis for comparison. Perhaps the steps vanishing to reveal a second path was a hint for us to go this way, or it could very well be a trap. Somehow, we didn't expect either route to be a particularly safe one. We stayed close together as we walked through the tunnel with only the flickering lights above to guide a path. The platform was wide enough for us to walk side by side, but we allowed the teenage trio to walk behind the rest of us, as they were still dealing with a traumatized and barely responsive girl. After a half hour or so, we still saw nothing more than the littering of rubbish across the concrete floor. But when Calvin pointed out the old newspaper and paper bags were now being disturbed by a subtle breeze that was blowing all around us, I felt my neck begin to tense. Maybe we're getting close to the exit, Tony suggested. Christ, I hope so, Calvin replied with a heavy sigh. Fucking leg is hurting like a son of a bitch. I could only imagine how much pain he was in, considering that my perfectly unharmed lower extremities are throbbing pretty good too. Of course, I was especially exhausted, having spent 6 hours in a bloody truck before coming to this damned place. After a few more minutes, we felt the ground begin to tremble beneath our feet. The previously barely responsive girl now screamed at the top of her lungs, before the other one wrapped her hands around their friend's mouth.
"Stop it," she said, holding her arms around the girl, who fought her tooth and nail. "We're all gonna die," Bridget cried out after wrestling herself free from a friend's grasp. She elbowed Monica in the gut when she tried to grab her again and took off running past us. "Damn it, Bridge, come back," Todd called out, scampering after her, with his date directly behind him. "Oh, fuck," Tony sighed, rolling his neck before giving me an exasperated look. We made the silent decision to attempt to pursue the three that ran ahead. We weren't about to force Calvin to go any faster than he was capable of with his swollen and bloody leg. I ran a little ahead of the other two, while Tony assisted his boyfriend as much as he could. We could still see the teens ahead, though the flickering of the lights had become far more erratic, occasionally leaving us in the dark for a minute or so at a time. I finally closed the gap to the three I was squatting on the ground. I buckled over, grabbing my aching side, while Todd and Monica were attempting to calm down the hysterical Bridget, who was flailing her arms while spitting out barely comprehensible words. As the rumbling of the floor grew stronger, the wall beside us began to shudder and shift. When it gradually began moving towards us, narrowing the path towards the open subway tracks, my heart was thundering with the realization that we may have chosen the worst possible direction to proceed after all. "Oh shit," Tony belted out, pointing his finger to the tunnel ahead. I turned my gaze from the moaning teens on the floor to the bright lights that illuminated the darkness ahead. It wasn't hard to figure out that the tremors and the approaching glow were a train speeding towards us. The platform was narrowing more and more as the lights drew closer. Bridget was screaming at the top of her lungs as the wall pushed us closer and closer to the track. "We gotta jump!" she cried out before breaking free of her friend's arms again. She leaped from the path and yelled out in agony when she landed with a loud crack on the ground below. Without hesitation, and honestly very impressive in his bravery, Todd slid down from the path to help her. Monica ran to watch over the ledge, hanging her arms over the side to help drag them back up. The lights were drawing closer by the second, as Monica aided her boyfriend in dragging the weeping Bridget back onto the narrow pathway. What happened next left my jaw agape for the third time that day. The three teenagers had successfully escaped the tracks before the approaching train arrived. Just as we saw the metal behemoth rounding the curve before us, the concrete of the platform beneath our feet began to quake violently, spider-webbing wide cracks across the surface. It took all of my focus and balance to remain on my feet, while Calvin and Tony held on to one another in an effort to prevent falling to the shuddering ground. The teenage trio was not so lucky. They were still sitting at the very edge of the platform after making their way back up from the tracks below, so when the ground crumbled and shook, it gave way where they perched, catching their collective breath. Monica turned her head towards us, with a startled expression of utter shock and anguish, as each of the teenagers tumbled off the landing and onto the tracks, just in time to meet the oncoming train. "No!" I cried out in protest, pointlessly reaching my arm to the three who had just met their sticky end with a loud splat that sprayed blood across the platform. Tony, Calvin, and I just stared at the rusted and ancient-looking subway car as it came to a halt before squeakily sliding its doors open across from where we stood. The wall was still steadily closing the gap between us and the train, giving us little choice but to board the heavily abused shell. The doors screamed shut behind us before the mildewed bricks sealed the landing we had left behind. Tony gasped when he turned his eyes to what lay inside, causing his boyfriend and me to share his reaction. Dismembered and burned wisps of translucent bodies sat upon the seats and stood in the aisle of the subway car we now inhabited.
"You look hurt,"
the somber and monotone voice of a thin, charred spectre said to Calvin, whose arm was clutching onto his wooden prop like a safety blanket. The slender and see-through man got to his feet and gestured back towards the now vacant seat with his one remaining arm. Calvin grew incredibly pale when he looked at the face of the spirit, whose left side was almost completely burned away, leaving only a melted and bubbled tissue and skull. Thank you," he shakily said to the scorched and torn phantasm, who bowed his head courteously. After taking his seat, he looked up at us with wide eyes and a trembling lower lip. The ghost, who had so graciously given up his seat, now wrapped his fingers around the metal rod that ran from the ceiling to the floor, before absent-mindedly glaring out of the window with his solitary eye. We were all still shaken up by the bloody demise of the teenage trio, and our current company did not help us to regain any manner of composure. None of the spectres appeared to pay us any attention, outside of the half-scorched one, who now only seemed concerned with the solid wall behind the glass. "What do we do now?" Tony asked, looking at his boyfriend and back towards me. I just shrugged and shook my head. I found words difficult to reach all of a sudden. My mind was still arguing that none of this could actually be happening. It was just a simple roadside attraction. Surely this was just some sort of performance. Such things as we had seen since descending that first flight of stairs could not rationally exist, right? Could we have been drugged before entering the room behind the fake iron doors? I let my own eyes turn towards the windows of the shuddering train to see nothing more than bricks and darkness outside, still contemplating the true nature of things I had seen so far. "What the hell is going on here?" Calvin asked, shaking his head from side to side. "Train," Tony replied, barely changing his expression. "I know it's a fucking train, Tony," Calvin said, shrugging his shoulders and looking agitated. "I mean, what is all of this?" We both just looked at him with no answers to give. "Well, it's safe to say we're not descending the 6 floors of fright, right?" Calvin continued, making air quotes with his fingers. "So how did we end up in a fucking forest, and then in a fucking train?" "Some sort of parallel dimension or something?" I asked, shrugging slightly. I wasn't prone to believing in such things, but it was the only thing that made any sort of sense, as far out of the box as the idea was. "Like each floor is, what, a different universe?" Tony asked, screwing up his face. "Could explain why the stairs vanished, I guess," Calvin said. Once more, our conversation gave way to somber silence, before I was jerked from my thoughts by the vibration of my cell phone in my pocket. "Des?" Jessica asked from the other side of the receiver. "Oh my god, Jess, where are you guys?" I asked with my pulse quickening. "We... last floor. Eat? You coming?" she said through so much static I could barely even connect the puzzle pieces of her words. "I can't hear you, babe," I said. "Are you and the kids safe? Did you make it out?" "I... don't... Jer... Pumpkin... Where?" Suddenly panic revisited me when my desperate plea for answers was interrupted as the train car began to shudder wildly as the darkness behind the glass gave way to flickering bright light. "Jess, baby, where are you?" I begged before the line went dead. It didn't take long to register that the glow from outside was actually coming from a fiery blaze that caused the windows to bubble and crack. The flock of translucent wraiths among us got to their feet before running for the subway car to the rear of where we stood. They all screamed in shared anguish and terror as they pounded on the door that appeared sealed. The side entrance we had entered through flew open to reveal the furious inferno in full color. Tony and I plastered ourselves against the walls, casting glances at each other and down to Calvin, who still sat staring out at the fire that surrounded us. "What do we do?" he cried out, looking back up to the two of us who clung to the wall of the car for dear life. "I don't know," Tony replied, almost emotionless and blank. As I continued to watch the flames beating against the outside of the train, I noticed flickers of blue behind them. "It's the sky!" I shouted. "It's the bloody sky!" They both just glared at me, with puzzled expressions on their faces. I'm not entirely sure what reasoning guided my actions, but I braced my arms and my right leg against the wall I was leaning on before turning back to Tony and Calvin. "I don't know if this is the right call, but I think we have to jump. Can't say what led me to that conclusion, but it was the only thing that made sense at the time. Even if I couldn't make out what she was saying, I knew now that my wife was alive. I had to get to her and the kids. I was prepared to risk whatever rash decisions I had to make to reach that goal." "Are you fucking serious?" Tony asked in a surprised tone. "I'm going for it. If you don't hear me screaming bloody murder, you may want to follow," I said, not so much as allowing myself to second-guess my actions, before pushing away from the wall and sprinting towards the opening. "Wait!" Calvin cried out before I passed through the open door. Though I was prepared to feel the flames scorching my flesh, I only felt the heat for seconds before I found myself falling. "Oh shit!" I screamed out as my stomach leapt into my throat, with a complete absence of the ground below me. I shrieked against the lurching in my gut while I careened downwards, my limbs weightlessly flapping in the air around me. It was as though I had been falling for both seconds and hours when I splashed into the cold water below. The roaring train fell silent as I sunk into the depths. I flailed around wildly before gathering myself up, thrusting my arms and legs against the water to work my way back up to the surface. When I broke through the lake, I cried out to the enormous bridge high above me, "It's safe!" I could still see the train that was engulfed in flames spinning across the tracks high above me. "You gotta jump!" I shouted out. Nothing. I bobbed around in the water for as long as I could, while the subway car sped towards the tunnel ahead. When I still saw no sign of Tony and Calvin when the train disappeared into the dark cavern, my stomach sank with the realization that I was now alone. I took a glance at what surrounded me to see land a ways off in the distance. With a heavy sigh, I looked upwards one last time before beginning my swim towards whatever surprises lay ahead. When I drew closer to the sandy riverbank, I hoped to take a moment to catch my breath. I should have known better than to get that far ahead of myself. When I felt something grab onto my leg only 10 feet or so from the shore, I wrestled to keep myself afloat but couldn't prevent myself from being yanked down into the depths below. I kicked my other foot to no avail, but when I looked to see the thick tentacle wrapped around my right shin, I screamed out a bubbling wail, an act that only served to allow what little oxygen I had left in my lungs to escape into the water. I dug my fingers into the dense meat that clutched onto my leg in an attempt to convince it to let go of me, but it didn't so much as wince at my attacks. It wasn't until I punched it as hard as I could with the pressure of the water around me, while still clawing at it with my other hand, that it finally loosened up enough for me to pull free of its grip. I thrust myself away from it as it charged at me again, refusing to allow my eyes to make contact with whatever the tentacle branched from. I just beat against the water as hard as I could until I noticed the tunnel ahead. I swam harder than I knew I could to distance myself from the stretching appendage that shot towards me once more. It almost grabbed me again, but I managed to kick it off and push my body closer to the opening ahead. As soon as I cleared the entrance, the creature bit against the opening, causing rocks to cascade, sealing it shut behind me. With my racing heart still in full panic mode, my lungs struggled for breath, but I continued to push as hard as I could. Finally, out of sheer desperation, I forced myself upwards, praying for the ability to escape a watery grave. I inhaled a deep breath of near-intoxicating oxygen when I broke free of the water. The air tasted stale, but still gloriously swelled within my lungs. Again I found myself bobbing along the surface, but I did not look out into the bright blue sky this time. My eyes met an enormous cavern that surrounded me, which appeared lit by an unseen source. The rippling water traced its reflection across the walls and the ceiling of the cave, and as I traced my gaze from above to across from me, I saw solid ground only a short swim ahead. I made quick work of my short trip to the riverbank, fearing whatever may still be staring up at me from the depths below. When I finally dragged my exhausted body into the hard ground, I just lay on my back, breathing so heavily I feared I may begin to hyperventilate. After some time, I finally climbed back to my feet, wincing when I put pressure on the leg the tentacle had wrapped around. I looked down to see the leg of my trousers torn to shreds, revealing a series of swollen, circular bruises. The initial pain faded quickly, but still felt mildly uncomfortable, causing me a slight limp as I shuffled onward. I slowly traversed the rocky path, keeping a steady lookout for anything that may be lurking behind me. I felt weighed down by my soaked clothing as I walked on. I had no idea if the direction I followed would lead me anywhere. After a while, I finally saw what caused the dim light to flow through the otherwise darkened cavern. Small, glowing, and winged creatures circled above me. They stayed close to the ceiling of the cave, which was some 50 or so feet high. It was while I was glaring up at the glowing, fluttering creatures that I felt a stab in my chest as I realized my only link to my family was still resting in my dripping wet pocket. Fuck! I belted out, looking down at my phone that showed no sign of life behind its moistened screen. I tried popping out the battery to see if I could wipe it off on my shirt, but it didn't have a dry spot on me to even attempt to smear away any of the water. With a burgeoning rage swelling within me, I reared my arm back to sling my device against the nearest wall. As I stood there, ready to release it from my grasp, I sighed and stashed the deceased black screen back into my drenched pocket. The path I walked slowly narrowed as it closed around the lake, which I left behind me as I wandered on. Though my route grew slimmer, it remained just as high, with a strange sort of sound echoing from somewhere in the distance. I picked up a decently sized rock in anticipation of the potentially monstrous things that may lay ahead, though I quickened my pace slightly. The pain in my swollen leg had finally reduced to the point that I only noticed it from time to time, so my journey through the cavern was growing more tolerable, though my chest was hammering like a construction crew at work. As the sounds ahead of me grew more erratic, I felt my back and neck tense up the closer I got. I rounded a sharp corner as the path slimmed even more before it opened to a wide room with a far lower ceiling than I had experienced thus far. There was a rocky stairway leading upwards on my right, while the noises booming above me began to mix with what sounded like screaming. I ran to the steps and looked up into the opening the stairs led to, but I could only make out more darkness. As I slowly began to set foot on the first step, the flock of the shimmering creatures charged right at me. I swatted at them furiously while little mouths bit into my fingers and arms. I fell to the hard ground, reaching for the rock that slipped through my grasp when they attacked. I looked up to see a veritable swarm of tiny faces staring back at me from above the first few steps. They were little winged people. If I believed in such things, I would be inclined to call them fairies. Surely this was just a trick of this strange illumination. I remembered how Jess would tell me that according to Halloween lore, fairies and spirits of the like were free to walk, or fly in this case, among us this time of year. I would often laugh when she brought up the more fantastical and supernatural elements of her beloved holiday. She always spoke with such reverence when she talked about such things. The fairies, for lack of anything reasonable to call them, just hovered there, guarding the stairway. I could only assume that I was not to be granted entry to whatever lay above me, so I put my hands out in front of me as though they held me at gunpoint. "Okay, I won't go up," I said. As soon as I finished my sentence, the throng of fluttering tiny people separated and flew off in various directions. What the actual fuck? I asked the steps I was not permitted to access. Once more I got to my feet and began to continue walking in the direction I'd been going. I was almost to the open exit at the rear of the room when I heard, "Run!" coming from above me. I whipped my head around to see Tony and Calvin sprinting down the steps. Floor 5. "Holy shit!" Tony exclaimed when I ran to meet them at the stairs. "How are you alive?" I explained what I had been through after I leapt from the train, before asking, "Why didn't you guys jump?" "You told us if you didn't scream to follow you," Calvin replied. "And you screamed." I laughed when I recalled my completely undignified, "oh shit," after I found only air beneath me. "So how did you guys get out?" Calvin went on to tell me about what happened after I left them behind. It would seem that the train came to a halt some moments after crossing the tall bridge. They were swarmed by the charred specters and forced to jump out into the flames, which faded as soon as they crossed from the subway car. They found themselves standing in front of a new set of stairs, leading them down to the 4th floor. The steps led them to a darkened desert with a moonless sky above. Almost immediately, they were chased by giant scorpions and tarantulas that erupted from the ground like a sandy volcano. As they ran for their lives, they fell into a bed of quicksand, which they sunk into quickly. With little doubt that this would be the end of their journey, they gave in to whatever fate lay beneath the ground, only to drop into a cavernous chamber beneath the sand. They were now faced with another stairway, as the beasts which chased them fell through the sand they had just passed through. "Sounds like you found yourself a little shortcut," Tony remarked with a smile. Though we all laughed at this statement, I could help but wonder if he was onto something. Having assumed I had still been on the 3rd floor, I began to rethink my stance on where we were. I had previously come to the belief that we were crossing some sort of dimensional gate between floors, but if I jumped down 2 floors, there had to be some sort of physical connection between them. I ran this new theory by my companions, to which they seemed skeptical at best. "I mean, that was sort of a fluke, right?" Tony replied. It's not like we can just leap off any ledges we come across and hope for the best. I couldn't deny that he had a point, but I still insisted we should at least keep our eyes peeled for anything that may seem out of place. They shrugged in halfway agreement, and we all headed for the exit I had almost reached when they came running down the steps. "How's the leg?" I asked after noticing Calvin wasn't using his branch to walk anymore. "Honestly, a fuck-ton better," he replied, pulling the wrapped shirt sleeve up to reveal the swelling had gone down considerably. The gashes still looked pretty gnarly, but he only had a slight limp now, compared to his borderline lack of mobility before. As we continued our stroll, the cavern walls became even more narrow, forcing us to proceed in single file, while the air around us had grown very thin. "Are you sure we're going in the right direction?" Tony asked through a slightly wheezing breath. "It has to be," I replied before explaining to them where I had come from. The ceiling was now only inches above our heads, and we had to turn our bodies to the side to keep going. We were all gasping for breath, as the thin air combined with the claustrophobic surroundings caused a certain degree of hyperventilation. As it started to get to the point where I wasn't sure if we would be able to progress any further, I felt my feet give out from beneath me as the ground formed a steep slant. "Shit!" I yelled out when I began to slide down the slick-angled chute. "Desmond!" I heard my name yell out from above me as I sped down the slippery slope. After a few moments, I once again found the ground removed from beneath me before I slammed down into the solid surface. "Bugger me!" I wheezed out with the wind completely knocked out of me. "Are you alive?" I heard from somewhere above me. I looked up the narrow opening that had just spit me onto the floor to see it maybe 10 feet above my head. I rubbed my aching and likely bruised ass while I pushed myself back up under my feet. "I think so," I replied to the opening in the lower ceiling, still catching my breath. After a minute or so, I heard the volume being cranked up on a scream as Calvin's feet came charging down from the entrance above. I quickly reached my arms out in an attempt to break its fall, while bracing for a likely painful impact. We both crashed back to the ground when I caught him before the yelling of his boyfriend came charging right at us. Without enough time to get to our feet, we both rolled in opposite directions to avoid getting crushed by the rapidly approaching Tony. "Oh, fuck me," he wailed after slamming onto the concrete floor. We all echoed winded laughter against the walls of the stone room we found ourselves in. Our bones creaked and cracked in unison while we lifted ourselves from the floor. We finally took a moment to look around at new surroundings. We were in an almost perfectly round room, with no exits in sight. No doorways, no holes in the ground, and no corridors leading out. It didn't take me long to understand what this was. We were in a fucking oubliette. "What's an oubliette?" Calvin asked when I spoke the thought out loud. "A dungeon, only accessible from an entrance above," Tony replied with a heavy sigh. "They used to leave people to die in places like these," I added, "to simply forget about them." "The hole isn't too high up," Calvin replied, sounding hopeful. "Even if we get back up," Tony replied, "where do we go from there? It's better than just waiting to die down here." I couldn't deny that he had a point. Even if we had to backtrack all the way to the lake, there had to be another way out. Only one floor remained, and I would be damned if I was just going to stay down here to rot, when my family may still be out there somewhere. Though the opening we had dropped through was not particularly high above us, it wasn't exactly as if we could just reach back up and pull ourselves through. "Can you give me a leg up?" I asked Tony while staring at the opening. He nodded and walked over to me, leaning his body down and cupping his hands to grab my foot. I stepped into his grip, and he heaved as he pushed me up to the hole in the ceiling. My hands could not find any sort of lip or ledge to grab onto. I even tried pressing both palms to the side of the thin opening, but the inner walls were far too slick. I should have realized that before I even attempted this, as we had all glided down here with such ease. After one last attempt, I toppled backwards, causing Tony and I to hit the hard ground with our backs once again. Tony just groaned, while I screamed obscenities at the opening while pounding my heads against the floor. It wasn't my most dignified moment, but my well was running severely dry. Over the next few hours, we made more attempts to make an ascent from the circular room, but nothing worked. I lay on the ground, staring up at the only exit to this room. Tony sat a few feet away with his head buried between his knees, and Calvin just paced around the room with frustration evident on his face. "Maybe we're being punished for something," Tony said, lighting a cigarette. "What could any of us have done that warrants this? I don't know, maybe we're all dead, and this is hell." He gazed off while taking a deep drag of his smoke. "Could they have known about our podcast?" Tony continued, turning his face to his boyfriend. "Is this supposed to teach us some sort of lesson?" "We don't deserve this. What the hell is this supposed to prove anyway?" Calvin shouted, becoming more agitated as he stopped walking and leaned up against the wall. "We'll figure a way out, mate," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "This is bullshit!" he screamed out, kicking the wall he had been propped against. "Damn it!" he said, dropping to the ground and grabbing the already injured leg he had just swiped at the wall. Tony got down beside him to assist in checking if he messed up his leg even more, while I walked towards the wall he had just attacked. "Do you hear that?" I asked while knocking my knuckles against the stone slab we were trapped behind. "Huh?" Tony said. It sounds hollow," I said, knocking harder, causing a slight echo of possibilities behind the wall. I rubbed my hand over the stone. It felt cold and firm, as a rock wall would, but it didn't feel as dense, if that makes any sense. I began to kick with the flat of my foot against the supposed concrete, which began to crack slightly. "Holy shit!" Tony barked, getting back to his feet and approaching me. The three of us beat, kicked, and banged on the wall, which slowly began to form wider and deeper cracks across its surface. After about 10 minutes of attempting to break through, the wall finally gave way, crumbling apart before our eyes. We stared over the rubble of false makeshift rocks to see what it looked to be some sort of back room or storage area. There were brooms leaning against the wall, along with a bucket of water and a mop sprouting from the top. After we worked our way over the scattered imposter boulders, we paced to the end of the room to find a simple wooden door. I turned the knob and swung the door open to reveal yet another staircase with flickering fluorescent lights above. "I hope to Christ this is the last bloody floor," I said with a heavy sigh. I took one last look back at the broken, fabricated wall. It began yet another, and hopefully one final descent into the darkness below. Floor 6. As I approached the foot of the stairs, I could see what appeared to be a damp road that reflected the moonlight that shone down from above. "What the fuck is this now?" I asked, looking back over my shoulder at Tony and Calvin. I stopped in my tracks when I saw nothing behind me but the steps I had just descended. "Tony!" I yelled out as I started to walk back up the stairs. "Calvin, where did you guys go?" I headed back up the steps before they had a chance to disappear on me. As soon as I reached the top, I could see that things were not as we had left them. The broom closet and fabricated oubliette had somehow been replaced with a perfectly normal-looking room. It was reminiscent of the first floor we had traversed what felt like days ago. Black cloth draped over the makeshift walls, though there were no plastic and latex ghouls or any other manner of festively spooky paraphernalia. I decided to investigate the area further to search for any hint as to where my colleagues had disappeared to. It took very little time to traverse the entirety of the area that was formed into something of a labyrinth through the aid of the false walls. I walked around the room for a while, finding no sign of a second exit, nor any trace of the two I had traveled with up until now. About halfway through my second lap around the empty room, the vibration of my previously deceased phone snapped my mind away from the puzzling surroundings.
"You gonna be home soon?"
Jessica asked.
"Dinner's almost ready. It'll get cold if you stay out all night."
"Jess?" I exclaimed, both shocked at hearing her voice and confused by her nonchalant manner. I turned around to find the staircase I had walked away from some time ago to be now standing directly in front of my eyes. I strolled down the stairs with my head spinning, while listening to the sounds of my kids calling out from the other side of the phone.
"Come home, Daddy,"
Jeremy yelled.
"Mommy's been cooking all day. You better get home quick,"
Sarah echoed from the background. I'll be there soon," I remarked after clearing the steps to see myself surrounded by the neighborhood I had left behind my taillights earlier that same day.
Love you, babe,
Jess said before the line went dead. I just stood in place, staring across the street we had lived on for close to a decade before my new job led to a cross-country trip. The street lamps illuminated the sidewalks, and Halloween decor scattered every single yard. There were always a handful of our neighbors who would decorate for the holidays, but it was never a full spread. It was nighttime, but the full moon shimmered down from above, which combined with the tall street lamps to make the path ahead an easy one to navigate. I slowly sauntered down the middle of the road as no cars passed by, neither coming nor going. I turned my head from left to right when I noticed that every single yard sported the very same seasonal adornments. Strobing lights and fog machines on each front lawn showed a flickering and misted silhouette of skeletons and pumpkins. Each house had its own circle of bony figures that clasped hands while they stared on through blackened and hollow eyes at the central scarecrow that perched upon a tall crucifix-like structure. Every now and then, the straw man in the middle appeared to make subtle movements from their wooden props, which may have just been the effect of the flickering lights playing with my eyes. Given the nature of the things I had witnessed since entering this damned place, the idea of moving Halloween decorations did not faze me in the slightest, as I strolled on in something of a wide-eyed trance. It didn't take me long to arrive outside the old house I used to live in with my family. There were no decorations in the front yard, and this was the only building on the street that had light shining from behind the closed curtains. Though I knew this was not in fact the actual street I left behind, it almost shocked and confused me to see the representation of my home as the only yard that was free of any festive decor. Ours was always the first to hold a remarkable display of pumpkins, ghosts, and witches, along with many other types of seasonal flair. More often than not, we had our front lawn decked out before September came to a close. Of course, it would take several days to complete whatever the annual theme would be. Though my wife adored the process of setting everything up, I can't deny that I attempted to convince her to take a year off from time to time. I would feel like the Ebenezer Scrooge of Halloween for requesting such a thing, and she would grow more upset at my suggestion than if she had caught me in the act plowing into the next-door neighbor's cute wife as she walked through the door. Still, it really could be exhausting sometimes, but I loved her. I was shaking all over when I reached a trembling hand to the door I had swung open countless times before. As I would have expected, I turned the knob to find it unlocked. "I'm home," I called out, hopeful that my family would be awaiting me. My heart sank when I walked into the dining room to see 3 scarecrows, not unlike the ones crucified on every lawn surrounding my home, sitting at the table. The 2 smaller ones sat on either side of the one in the middle, which was surely meant to serve as a substitute for my wife. I reached out my violently trembling hand to the taller of the scarecrows, almost certain what I would find underneath the burlap mask. As I slowly pulled the sack away, I screamed out in agonized horror, falling to my knees beside the table my family had eaten many meals upon before. I still had my white-knuckled fingers tightly gripped under the hard fabric bag that had large buttons for eyes, while I bellowed out against the sight of my beautiful wife's wide-eyed stare and pale, lifeless skin. For what felt like hours, I just sat in the same spot, wailing in sorrow. I couldn't bring myself to pull away any of the other sacks that surely disguised the vacant gaze of my children. I just stayed in place and wept. Until... it's a damn shame that came from behind me. I slowly turned my head to see my old buddy Sammy leaning up against the wall, still wearing his ridiculous ringleader's garb. "You son of a bitch!" I yelled out as I charged the bastard I held responsible for the death of my family. I slammed hard into the far wall of my kitchen after the portly man vanished before I could reach him. I gathered myself from the floor, gripping at the shoulder that had cracked the drywall, while darting my gaze around the room in search of the man I had determined would die by my hands before the day was done. My jaw fell slack again when I found the room completely vacant. No longer did the corpses of my wife and children sit around the also absent dining table. The house appeared completely empty, just as we had left it when we drove away from it for the last time so many hours ago. My chest still throbbed from the revelations of the last few moments, but I felt hope spark within me again. Could this have just been another illusion? Was my family still alive out there somewhere? So many questions. After a quick search through my old home to find nothing and nobody inside, I made my way back towards my front door, which now stood closed and locked, although I had left it splayed open upon entering. I swung the door open to see 9 scarecrows standing in a row on the road directly in front of my old house. They were all planted in place, staring back at me through the unevenly sewn button eyes. Their order started on the left with the tallest, and ended with the shortest, which I assumed to be the same one that previously represented my son. Acting as perfectly choreographed group, they all reached up with their right arm and yanked the bow-like masks from the head. They now glared through pale and cataract eyes directly into my own. Sure enough, Jeremy was on the far right, while Tony stood on the left. Each of my family members, and every one of the sextuplet that I began my journey through the 6 floors of fright with, now appeared very much alive, also quite dead before me.
This is all your fault,
they echoed together in a mishmash of very different voices, though equally as monotone. I paced backward, was still glaring at the row of pale faces that began to slowly saunter towards me. After only a couple of steps, I felt my back press against the now closed door that I had no recollection of even passing through.
You did this to us,
they continued while marching forward, with every movement of their limbs a carbon copy of the neighbor. I reached behind me and jiggled the doorknob, desperate to gain entry to the house. When it wouldn't budge, I darted my eyes from side to side to find the short fence that used to wrap around my home now stood so tall it could not even register the top. With the pacing throng blocking my exit to the front and the immense enclosure preventing any escape to either side, I ran my shoulder against the entrance to the house that showed no sign of giving way.
You deserve to die for what you did to us.
They continued in their eerie chorus as they trudged across the damp grass of my old lawn. I ran to the left and attempted to kick and push through the thin wooden pikes that reached high above, but it felt as though I were ramming against a steel door. Finally, I fell to the ground, both winded and sore from my fruitless attempts to escape, as well as mentally exhausted from the insanity I had endured since descending that first flight of stairs. My precious pumpkin was the first to close the gap between me and my undead pursuers. She still looked so innocent and cute while she glared at me through her whitened wide eyes. I just reached out with my arms and wrapped them around her as she tucked her head into my shoulder to bite into the flesh. I felt the immense pain when the hordes of other members began to claw at my arms and legs while my beloved daughter chewed onto my shoulder. I wasn't afraid anymore. If my family were indeed free of the pains of this world, I would join them soon. This was not the way I had hoped to relocate them when I began my quest through the roadside attraction, but it didn't matter anymore. Not really. I closed my eyes to welcome the darkness that lay behind them. "What the hell are you doing?" I heard a familiar voice call out, causing my eyes to dart back open again. Calvin, the real Calvin, charged towards me, swinging a bloodied axe which he dug into the head of a green, scaly-faced and pointy-eared, goblin-like creature whose teeth and lips were covered in my blood. Tony was kicking and punching the others, while his boyfriend reached his hand out to pull me up from the ground where I still lay. All of the 9 bodies who had marched towards me from the road had transformed into these bizarre fantasy creatures, though they still wore the tattered scarecrow costumes. Calvin placed a foot on the back of the thing that had previously been chewing on my shoulder and yanked the blade out, allowing a yellowed and foul-smelling ooze to spew from the open wound. He lobbed the weapon to Tony, who buried it deep into the neck of the tallest of the goblins. A clawed hand swung towards my midsection, which I caught by the wrist before breaking forearm bones across my upper thigh. Tony swung the axe from side to side, splitting the green-skinned beast across the chest and neck. More of their sickly colored and scented fluids sprayed across the light blue siding of the house I once called home, while the sounds of cracking bones and tearing flesh echoed across the street. After a short but grueling battle, All 9 of those hideous creatures lay still on the ground that I thought was to serve as my final resting place, had my friends not intervened. The 3 of us stood panting and heaving for fresh oxygen as we stared down at the carnage we had wrought. I turned to look at my friends, who stood winded by the side of me. They looked like they'd been through hell themselves. Both had blackened and swollen eyes, split lips, inflamed ears, and bloody noses. Calvin's bald head had a deep gash on top, and clumped chunks of scarlet in his matted beard. Tony had cuts and scratches across the arm, whose sleeve still wrapped around his boyfriend's knee. Without a word, I pulled them both into an embrace, sincerely grateful for the unexpected rescue. After seeing their doppelgangers sharing in the company of the dead teenagers, I was sure they had somehow met their end before they could reach the base of the stairs that led me here. Perhaps I would not so quickly have resigned myself to a brutal death had I known I was not yet alone in this.
"Okay, bud, that's enough," Calvin chuckled, wrestling my arm from around him.
Sorry, I replied, returning his laughter. I thought it was done for.
"We did too," Tony said.
He went on to explain that they found themselves on the paved pathway of a park they used to frequent together when they reached the base of the stairs. Calvin remarked that they assumed I had walked on ahead, while they talked back and forth while descending the steps, after they noticed I was no longer in front of them. They too had met a small herd of scarecrows, who revealed themselves to be me, the teens from before, and 4 guys they had met in the same park under the moonlit sky some years before. Said individuals had taken turns beating the couple black and blue back in the day for apparently insulting them by showing a public display of affection, which the 4 had found more offensive than they could allow. My friends wasted no time in defending themselves against the group, though they did flee after being overwhelmed by the greater numbers. They ran to a nearby hotel where they found the axe hidden away behind a glass in case of emergency box. Once they were armed, the battle fared much more in their favor when the group arrived before them again. After some blood had been spilled, the illusion faded, revealing the scaled green faces of the very things we had just put down. "How did you get here?" I asked. If the stairs had taken them somewhere different from where they led me, I can't help but wonder how they were able to locate me.
"Through there," Tony replied, pointing towards a simple wooden door that stood in the middle of the road, several houses down from mine.
"Just appeared after we finished off those things," Calvin said, staring at the door. My heart began to race again at the idea that my family could be behind that door, possibly facing off against their own horde of ravenous goblins. Without a word, I started to run towards it, though my exhausted legs made my progress slower than I would have liked. Within a moment, Tony and Calvin were running beside me, obviously still holding far more energy than my tired body contained. To be young again.
"You sure you want to just rush in like that?"
Tony asked as I reached out to the doorknob. "I have to find them, mate," I replied, feeling my eyes well up again.
"We got your back, brother,"
Calvin said, giving me a clap on the back. I looked between the 2 of them who stood on either side of me again. "I seriously can't thank you guys enough," I said, turning my head from side to side to look at them in the eyes. "I would have been dead if you hadn't shown up when you did." They both just offered me a smile, and Tony gave me a small nod.
"Ready?"
"As we'll ever be, I suppose," Calvin replied. I pulled the door open to reveal a busy restaurant, adorned with a variety of spooky decor. The scent of freshly cooked food, combined with the inviting aroma of a delightful pub, caused my stomach to rumble and my mouth to water. My companions and I just glared from the other side of the entryway, awaiting whatever grim surprise lay hidden within the bustling room ahead. We were all hesitant about walking through the opening in the middle of the road, even more so after every head in the room turned to face us. Applause erupted from the crowd that sat at tables or perched by the bar. Some got to their feet while singing our praises.
"What the actual fuck?"
Calvin said in a monotone voice. Tony and I just shrugged. It wasn't until Sammy himself peered around the side of the open door I felt inspired to enter the room. I darted forward, grabbing the pudgy man by his collar and kicking his feet from under him, as I reared back with my tightly balled fist with the full intention of striking the man who still wore a silly grin on his smug face. I felt a gentle grip around my wrist. I turned my still grimacing face to meet the lovely smile of my beloved wife. "Oh my God," I called out, dropping the rotund man to the floor to wrap my arms around her.
I'm so proud of you, babe,
she said, kissing me on the cheek as Sarah and Jeremy ran up and hugged us both. I just stood in place, holding my family close, taking no time to consider the implications of what was really going on here. I peered up from Jessica's shoulder to see Tony and Calvin still staring in confusion. I backed up from my wife while my kids remained wrapped around my waist to take another look around the room I now found myself in. Amongst the many smiling and cheering faces, I noticed the 4 teenagers who had died between the first 3 floors, sitting at a round table with a large pitcher of beer in the center. "What the fuck is this, Jess?" I asked my wife, suddenly feeling the veil lift from before my eyes. I just glared at my wife, who wore a somewhat guilty and sheepish smile. I felt a thick arm wrap around my shoulder as Jessica replied,
"This is my Uncle Sammy. He's been dying to meet you."
"Are you taking the fucking piss?" I exclaimed, pulling myself away from the still grinning Uncle Sammy. "We almost died. They did fucking die," I continued, pointing my finger at the 4 teens who appeared completely unfazed by this whole experience. "They got the shit kicked out of them," I said, gesturing to Tony and Calvin, whose injuries across their shocked faces appeared to be slowly fading away. I rubbed my fingers across my shoulder to feel something more akin to a wound received months before. I looked at my palm to see no more than a thin trace of blood from the still damp fabric of my shirt. I felt my knees weaken and my head spin while I stood in place, grasping for any sort of rationalization for what was happening. I thought you were dead," I said, gazing into my wife's eyes. My heart was racing and I was trembling all over, feeling suddenly nauseated. "I saw your body," I continued as I felt a cold sweat accompanying the blood leaving my face. How could you?" I felt my legs turn to jelly as I dropped to the floor before my dizzy head allowed the darkness behind my eyelids to take the place of the crowded restaurant. "Sir?" A stern voice spoke out, awakening me from the involuntary slumber. I opened my eyes to see a tall, thin, older man wearing a cheaply made Frankenstein monster costume. "You asked to see a manager, yes?" the man asked, glaring down at me. "Huh?" I replied as my eyes began to focus on the familiar lobby of Sammy's Halloween Spooktacular.
"He was looking for his family,"
the monotone voice of the ragdoll girl said from behind the man as she handed him her skull-wrapped tablet. "Ah, yes," he said, tapping his fingers gently on the screen. "It appears they have cleared all 6 floors. If you'd like to take the stairs to the right or the elevator to the left," he gestured at the 2 entryways on either side of the back wall, "they will take you up to the arcade at the top. If your family hasn't come back down yet, that's likely where they are." "Up? I mean, the floors went down," I replied, still feeling groggy. "I'm sorry," the tall man said. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, sir." My senses were still heavily muted from the day's events and my subsequent passing out. But as I began to argue with the man in the Frankenstein costume, I heard a familiar scream coming from behind me.
"Daddy, Daddy!"
Sarah yelled out as she ran to me, wrapping her arms around my neck. Jess was carrying Jeremy in her arms as she strolled towards me.
"I think they got a little freaked out on the last floor,"
she remarked, rubbing our son's back with a hand. It wasn't until later that night, after the kids were safely sleeping in the adjoining room, that I decided to talk to my wife about the events I knew to have taken place that day. I wasn't entirely convinced that it had all been a manifestation of my sleeping mind while I awaited my family in the lobby of the roadside attraction. My theory was validated when I looked at the faded, bite-sized scars on my shoulder after I got out of the shower. She just chuckled and hung her head when I showed her the marks left by the ravenous goblins that somehow appeared to have long since healed.
"I told him not to be so hard on you,"
she replied with a shrug, glaring down at the mattress she was propped upon. I just stared at her, completely lost for words.
"There's a reason Halloween is such a big deal in my family,"
she continued, spiraling her long hair between her fingers as she spoke.
"Uncle Sammy is actually my great, Well, a lot of greats.
She laughed.
Great Uncle saw Wayne, and he takes this time of year very seriously.
We sat in silence for some time. I could barely wrap my mind around the things that occurred within the walls of the 6 floors of Fright, which were apparently helmed by the spirit of Halloween itself. I certainly couldn't come to grips with the idea that my own wife sent me on this path in the first place.
You were never in any real danger,
Jess said softly while I searched for anything to say.
You probably shouldn't have got so confrontational with him, though.
Really? I barked. So it's my fault that he put me through hell.
No, I mean, I'm not saying that. He told me he just wanted to have a little fun with you. I didn't expect him to get so carried away.
She laughed again until I glared at her with a scowl.
I'm sorry,
she said, darting her eyes back to the blanket she was fidgeting with. I just continued to glare at her while she maintained a stare-off with the blanket.
You mad at me?
She asked, still refusing to look at me. Yep. It's been some time since that cross-country road trip, and Jess and I are still together, regardless of the insanity of that day. Sure, we went through a good deal of counseling after we settled down into our new home, but I still love her, even if she is a somewhat psychotic demon spawn. God, I hope she doesn't listen to this. Halloween is approaching again, and our yard is more decked out with festive decor than ever before. Pumpkin and Jeremy are as excited as always, and they apparently remember nothing about the trip that found us at Sammy's Spooktacular. That's probably a good thing. I still keep in touch with Tony and Calvin. We exchanged contact information after bumping into them leaving the same hotel we stayed in the morning after that bizarre day. They attended some therapy themselves after promising to never include Sammy's in their podcast, which no longer focused on exposing attractions, but on enjoying them and recommending them instead. Truthfully, they were remarkably cool about the whole ordeal. The scars on my shoulder are barely visible anymore, but I still have the occasional nightmare that revisits some mutated and deformed version of my daughter. I can honestly say that I still don't care for this time of year, but I'll be damned if I admit that to Jess. She told me that we're going to have a special visitor this year. Her great uncle is going to be in town, and he's apparently quite excited about seeing me again. Safe to say, the feeling is far from mutual. Just be sure to follow those traditions of the season, yeah? Leave those jack-o'-lanterns lit. Make sure you have some candy for the trick-or-treaters. Toss up a decoration or two, even if it's just a random skeleton sitting in a lounge chair. Should you ever see a billboard that reads, Sammy's Halloween Spooktacular, I'd have to recommend that you just keep on driving. I highly doubt that any random customer will get the VIP treatment I received, but better safe than bloody. On that note, happy Halloween, folks. God help me.